What's up, YouTube? Today we're going to talk about using the brush tool and Lightroom, and specifically how I got this photo to go from this to this with just a few simple techniques I do right inside of Lightroom. Let's jump straight in. So basically, here's the original one. This is straight out of the camera, just the raw filter. I typically always start with the exposure, contrast, and things like that. And just looking at this picture, I already know that I'm underexposed in the background, underexposed here with the plants, and then overexposed heavily back here. And I did have my off-camera flash somewhere off in this area. So that being said, we'll jump right into it. Let's go ahead first and we'll brighten the exposure. And this is something that, most of you probably already do. We'll go a little bit with the contrast, probably too much there. And then the highlights, I'm overexposed here, so I don't want to touch the highlights yet. And then shadows, the same thing, since I'm underexposed back here. So I'll leave shadows and highlights alone. I won't do anything with clarity. I won't do anything with vibrance just yet, or saturation. We're actually going to jump straight into the brush tool. So let's go ahead and we'll pick our brush tool. And one way that I typically get started with it is I like to always go ahead and either fully expose my exposure if I'm going to start with the background, which we'll probably start with the foreground first, or I'll completely darken it. And the reason I do that is so that I know what I'm working on. But one other thing you should do, a lot of the times by default, Adobe will have your feather and flow both at 100. And all this means is if I was to paint with my flow at 100 and my feather at 100, I'm going to instantly get a dark image when I go to paint with that. And it's the same thing if I wanted to adjust whites and I paint with it. It's gonna just 100% is gonna control that. So let's go ahead and get rid of that real quick. Now, if you take your flow, and this is how I actually work my brush tool. If you take your flow and you drag it all the way down to about maybe 15 or 20, I want to say about 20 is typically what I have mine at. This is how I get my, some of my skies and things like that to have that, that glowing sun effect, or, highlighting over her skin and things like that. So to get it to do this, with your flow down to about 20%, what I do is I'll go ahead and we'll start with this foreground. We want to get this this grass to kind of bring or blend in a little bit. So we'll paint over here just a little bit, not too much, but just enough to where you can start noticing the difference. We'll paint over here where it's overexposed, and then we'll probably get a little bit up here too, and then right up here in the tree. And we want it to all kind of blend in with the rest of, as far as the grass go, you want it to all kind of blend in a little bit. And of course I'm rushing through this. I just really wanted to show you guys this technique because it's so important and it helps me in so many of my photos. All right, and so now what we'll do is we'll double click to default that, and then we'll gradually dial the exposure down just until we get it where we want it. And it's gonna be pretty close because it was pretty heavily exposed. And then we'll take the highlights and we'll bump the highlights completely down in that too. Now, just looking at that from before and after, we already have a really good idea of what it looked like. So this here is before, this here is after, and there's still things we can do as far as bumping the contrast, as well as we're gonna go with the blacks and then the shadows as well. So, oops, wrong way. Now, if you look at this here, so this area that was overexposed versus this area here that we kind of, fix the exposure just a little bit in there, just to kind of make that grass and make that tree and everything kind of blend in a little bit more with what's already lit by the sun. And of course we can dial into that a little bit more and get a little bit more finicky with it. But for the sake of this tutorial, I just want to kind of show you guys just some generic, steps that I take. Now, the sky was the biggest thing for this photo. We'll look at this and it's already underexposed, but with skies, when you're dealing with the sun, you're talking about something that's already extremely bright. So we'll hit new over here, and then we're gonna reset this by double clicking on effect. And then the exact same thing that we did to darken the exposure over here by the grass, we're just gonna brighten the exposure all the way to the max. All right, so with the brush, we're gonna make sure that your opacity is at 20%, and we're gonna lightly, one stroke on each pass. So you don't wanna do it too many times to make one area brighter than the other area. All right, so if we look at the before and after now, we have the brighter background, the darker foreground, and versus the darker background and the brighter foreground. So now to fix this a little bit more, what I did is this is where I started incorporating the color. So we're gonna add a bunch of warmth into this background part here. And that's instantly gonna give us that really nice, beautiful golden hour depth of field. And so from there, what I did is I brightened my exposure again, but I created a new brush stroke. And this time I wanted to focus mainly up here. And I was gonna paint in a bunch of areas, mainly with the same 20% opacity to get this to kind of, we'll go back up with it. I'm not actually doing anything. There we go. To actually get this to start popping a little bit for us. And then we'll do this here. And now from the main, we're gonna bump up the warmth on that just a little bit. And now we'll adjust the contrast a bit more. And then now I'm gonna actually bump my shadows, oops, wrong way, there we go, to give it a nice little depth. So as you can see, just with this photo where we're at right now, we'll look at the before and after. We were here, very dark background, very bright foreground. She was pretty dark. And just with a few simple brush strokes at 20%, learning that flow and the difference in how many times it actually takes it to get 100%, you're able to really dial in and actually control that. Now we look at the image that I actually completed. I did actually go ahead and paint over her face a little bit to brighten her face. Now in a natural lighting situation with the sun being in front of her, her face wouldn't have been lit. But for the sake of this photo and what I wanted it to look like, I went ahead and actually did that by just grabbing another brush tool and creating a spot right by her face. Oops, we'll create a new one. And then just slightly painting over in her area. Not too much, but just enough to where you can actually see her, because the picture is still about her and we want to make her, you know, the main focus. So I painted a little bit about that, like that there, go back, oops. And so now this is what we've got. And of course, like I said, I was, you know, I'm moving a little bit quick on this tutorial, but I just wanted to show you guys just mainly, you know, kind of how I got it to look the way that I did. And then we'll fix this background a little bit more. We'll add some more warmth back here to it. This is way too much, but we're gonna do, there we go. All right, and then we'll dial this down and then brighten it slightly. And then we'll do the contrast. There we go. Now we're starting to get some of that color tone to come back in there. Now it looks like the sun's kind of bouncing right off the trees. We'll add a little bit more here. And then it's bouncing right off the trees, right over the water, and then bouncing off of her skin. By the time we crop this and get it all situated where we want it to be, we end up having a really nice looking photo, something similar to what I just showed you guys. So let's crop this a little bit. And then one last thing that I typically always do, I hate the color green. If I can help it, you know, I would remove that from all my photography, but I usually always just desaturate my green, or not desaturate it, but I would actually change the hue so that it can, especially if it's like a summer, you know, photo or golden hour, I change it so that it can actually blend in a little bit more. Of course, you can't do this if your subject is wearing green, because then it starts looking real funky. So you have to kind of manually do it and use the brush tool again, which gets really, really complex sometimes. But for the most part, you know, I would just go ahead and take the hue with greens and then just drag that down just a little bit, just to kind of help with that. And then skin tones under orange. You can kind of tweak her skin tones and things like that. But from there, I would simply just take this, go into Photoshop, and then do some other things like, you know, skin softening, mainly just to kind of, you know, help it a little bit more. But that's pretty much the gist of it. This brush tool is so key when it comes to actually using, or when it comes to actually editing your photos. Using that brush tool is definitely one of my favorite tools in Lightroom, because of the fact that I can control my size and literally dial down each individual area if I wanted to. Mainly, guys, though, what you want to do is use that brush tool as much as you can. You know, get familiar with it, and definitely that can help get you some way better edits in the future. Remember, videos drop every Monday. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. Hit that little bell right next to it so you never miss an episode. But that's it, though. Keep shooting. I'm just gonna end it like that.